Hi, everyone. Welcome to Empowered Astrology. I'm Christopher Mitchell, astrologer, human on Earth, among other things, and I'm here with Tom Jacobs, also an astrologer, energy worker, spiritual teacher, channel, medium, and all around cool fellow. This is a project that we're starting together to explore astrological ideas through an empowered lens. We're calling it Empowered Astrology. And we're kicking off today with the first episode of our series on astrological basics, where we'll be going through the basic building blocks of astrology and breaking them all down before getting into other kinds of topics and episodes further down the line. Tom, do you want to say hi?
Hello.
Hello.
Happy to be here.
Cool. So, yeah, diving in with the sun and the moon, or the luminaries, like as they're called. I was thinking about how they're the first things that a lot of us learn about astrology, right? Like most people know their sun sign before they even know what astrology is, and maybe the second thing they learn is their moon sign. And I think that that's reflected in how when we look up at the sky, the first things that we see are and notice up there are the sun and the moon, these big prominent bodies. Do you want to kick us off by kind of saying something about the prominence and the preeminence of the sun and the moon in astrology, and if they maybe have, if that maybe represents something about their meaning and importance within the system?
Yeah. So this, tropical astrology, Western astrology that we do here is geocentric. That's the vast majority of astrology that you'll find where Earth is at the center. And so, from our perspective, the sun and the moon, like visually from Earth, maybe not so different in size all the time. But of course, the sun is very large and the moon is relative to that very small. But these parts of personality, these aspects of how we are, how we experience ourselves. When we first got on this call, I was thinking, like, I used to get the question, which is more important? My sun or my ascendant, or my sun or my moon, or going through like which is more important, and to realize that each represents a different aspect of personality or personality expression, personality development is super important. And so the sun is obviously the largest thing in the solar system. It is actually named after the sun, solar system. Everything orbits it. And I would say like identity development, having a sense of self. I always think of all the bodies in the chart you might use, no matter how many there are, just the basics or or asteroids and whatever, that they're each a voice in a meeting inside your head or inside your psyche. And the sun needs to be the decision maker, the manager, the CEO, something like that, where that part of you is taking opinions from all these other parts, but then making a final decision that benefits the whole. So there's a centrality to the sun. And you can kind of tell if somebody doesn't do his or her sun, because you'll say like, what? You're a Taurus? Really? And if you understand about what a Taurus is about, and that person might not behave that way, maybe that manager in the meeting isn't really in charge or hasn't yet developed or taken over. So it is quite obvious if it's doing something. The moon, of course, like, physically is much smaller. And the moon is a satellite of the Earth. So all these things are orbiting the sun, and the sun is a center, so it's got this giant presence. And the moon, you think about the moon as emotions or feeling or sensations, how we like to feel. Like what feelings do we like or pursue? What makes me happy? That's orbiting the Earth, which you could think of as your body. So one is the sun is the giant center thing, and then the moon is kind of like this changeable, always, often changeable, perhaps daily, experience of your emotions and as you are in your body, your feelings, your needs, what you'd like to feel. So that's just a little contrast. We do consider them two of the three most important personality markers typically in astrology. Again, the other one being the rising sign or the ascendant, which we'll cover some other time. And they are very important, and it's good to understand those two different roles. And then eventually, when you learn about signs and houses, you can understand what each one needs in order to be balanced with these two most important, to feed each of them, and with these two most important, aspects of personality.
As you were breaking that down with the sun being in the center and the moon moving around the earth, I started thinking about light. And I wondered if there's a role to bring that into the conversation, since they are the luminaries, right? And it's
Right.
the sun is giving off light and then the moon is reflecting the light. Does that have something worth saying in it for you?
Yeah, I think that's really important. Again, that idea of the geocentric astrology, everything in your chart representing is representative of an archetypal reflection of the sun's light back to the earth. So as we're on earth, the sun's light going off of the moon or Jupiter or Pluto, whatever, the sun's light going off of Mercury, that energy that it comes back to us is how we're wired and how this quote, the stars affect us, unquote. So the sun in you is a source of fuel, a source of motivation regarding, again, a feeling of having a sense of self or developing ego. And it's kind of like the fuel you'd like to burn, or that makes the most sense for you to burn. And then the moon, of course, only reflects light, so this is a changeable, changeable position, but you're feeling, and it's constantly changing. So anyway, if that answers that. But light, of course, everything in astrology, and what people sometimes mislabel Vedic astrology or Indian astrology. The name for it is Jyotish,
Mm.
and I'm not an expert in this, but I know that's the right word for it. But anyway, it's the science of light.
Mm.
That's what that means. Yeah.
I can feel a little portal there. Like we could potentially take a tangent and end up having a whole podcast about what is light from like a metaphysical point of view, but I think we can leave that there, since it's its own kind of spiritual thing to unpack and keep talking about the sun and the moon here. But yeah, it's interesting to think about it in those terms. So we've already kind of covered the sun a bit in overview. I want to pivot to the sun and start talking about it specifically. Talked about it as the CEO at the table in the head, and kind of the fuel of the personality self. What are some other key ways to think about the sun and what it represents in the chart, or some of the multitude of angles that we can take on interpreting it?
Yeah. Creativity, vitality, seeking joy, or how do I feel happy and joyful? Think about the we're not getting into all the different, sign and house and everything, but that sense of like a leonine expression, that's the sun is the center of that archetype, And so playfulness, creativity, and then of course in different houses and signs in the chart, it's filtered through it has different motivations and different priorities, but it is about creativity, expressiveness, playfulness, and sense of self, egoic development. But so I'd add in creativity as a huge one. And even in ways that we don't, like pursuits and behaviors we might not think of as creative, when a person like puts his energy towards something and he's focused on something, like a priority that might be in line with his sun configuration, it's creative because you're generating something. You're generating energy. You can think of it as you're spending fuel on this. You're putting your light toward this endeavor, and so there's a sense of like generating things, creating. So even if it's not performative or whatever that we think of as creative, like painting, dancing, singing, whatever, when you put your energy into something, you're creative.
And this is where I guess we would get some people will tie the sun to things like vitality, or
Totally.
well, and they'll you might say there's some aspect coming around to the sun, and one's physical
Hmm.
energy might be somehow affected by that or reflected in the symbology of that. That's
Yeah,
creative juice, right? Physical
definitely. Well,
expression.
yeah, and I'd say the freedom to, how do you say this? Like feeling free to express in your natural way. If there are barriers to that, one won't feel healthy. Like a Sagittarius who doesn't seek adventure, a Scorpio who doesn't tell the truth, a Gemini who is really closed-minded. It's not the nature. I'm just picking random keywords associated with those. The opposite of what's healthy in that sign. Because Scorpio needs to tell the truth and play detective. A Sagittarius needs to expand. A Capricorn needs to structure something. And if one doesn't do one of the many, many, many things that fits with their natural sun configuration, they may feel energetically and or physically weakened. Not trying to, create a doomsday prediction about anything, but your vitality in some sense, other chart factors aside, you know, I had a roommate who used to say, you have to know what kind of animal you are. And she meant, look, if you're a zebra, you have stripes. You can't not have stripes if you're a zebra. That's what she meant. Or if you're, a jaguar, you might, or a cheetah, you got spots. Like that's the animal you are, and it's really like that. So if I, as a Scorpio, much of my life tried to be like a Libra, and nobody would ever guess I was a Scorpio sun, because I was trying to be nice because I didn't want to be rejected or told I was too much or too intense. And so I avoided it, and it really did affect my vitality and my sense of, just being able to be present or peaceful in my body. Because again, the sun as a center of the solar system, the sun as the center of your psyche. It's a huge amount of real estate inside your head if you're not comfortable, for example, being a Cancer sun or an Aries sun or whatever it may be.
Hmm. And this connects to kind of like simple conversational ideas of things like being yourself, like letting your light
Right.
shine, right? And it's like if we're suppressing our sun or if we're denying a part of our sun, that light's not shining, and our physical apparatus, everything about us will be affected by
Yeah.
that kind of relationship to the self.
Yeah.
You were just saying that something about like if you're a cheetah and you've got spots, if you're this, you've got this, and it makes me think of or I wanted to think about how in sun sign astrology, right, which is
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people again's first entry point into having these kinds of conversations. As an astrologer out in the world, at work or something, if somebody hears that I'm an astrologer, one of the first things they'll say to me is often, "Oh, I'm a this," and they'll identify with their sun. And I
Yes.
wonder if you want to unpiece that a bit, or if it's actually kind of accurate to think that way. Essentially, the question is our sun who we are on the most essential level?
Yeah, and that makes me think about if someone were to ask which is more important, my sun or my moon, and I would say again there are different jobs or different categories of experience each represents, or a different job that each one has. And so the sun is the biggest, but the moon is personal and intimate. So I think as far as, it doesn't make sense to identify that way. It makes total sense to identify that way in the beginning, and then she might learn, oh my gosh, there's a moon sign, a Mercury sign, a Venus sign, a Mars sign, all the different things that we end up putting together to really understand a person in deep ways. But yeah, it makes total sense we start there because it is the biggest thing. Some people have groupings of planets and other signs. Like I have grouping called a stellium, or the plural is stellia, and I have a one in Sagittarius and one in Libra, and my Scorpio sun's between them, basically by itself. And so I would rather, like, thinking about those archetypal qualities. If you know about those signs already, you can just think like, well, maybe like he doesn't want to tell the truth. because he doesn't want to hurt people. But these other planets, these parts of him that are like clicks, right? If I have 4 planets in Libra and 3 in Sagittarius, it's like that many parts of my personality are on the same wavelength. And then there's that sun saying, wait a minute, can I be a Scorpio? Like, I'm outnumbered here. There are 7 of you, and there's 1 of me. So that sun had to grow up, right? But the I lost my train of thought. Can you help me get back?
Yeah. It's kind of the juice of the question is like, and I think you're helping to expand it out and say like, okay, so at first we get to know ourselves through our sun,
Yes.
and then we start to see that there's more to the
Yes.
chart than the sun, and so it ends up being that we're not just our sun.
Right. We're not just our sun, but yes, thank you. But it is a huge part of us.
And it is a big part of us, which is so the kind of the question there of like, why would so many people identify as being their sun? Well, because it's a very large part, and it's a very obvious thing that we get to know first, and so that might be where people. I guess I was wondering why it's so common for people to identify as their sun sign.
Well, that's the most readily available interpretations are based on that, and it's easier to think about being a baseball fan, and you like baseball. Lots of people like baseball. Stadiums can fill up with people who like baseball when games are happening, right? But then some people will have taken the time to get to know the roster of their team, their favorite team or their favorite 2 or 3 teams. Like the rosters and basically the job roles and the stats, right? And so it's kind of I think it's not everybody may be inclined to develop depth with it, but we start with the sun sign astrology because it's in the newspapers. Or it had been. I don't know if newspapers still exist, but that sense of like, whatever, online columns of, these kinds of generic things where you don't have to know a lot. Like if you have a desire to root for a team, that doesn't mean you have a deep need to understand, all the pitching staff. Or, I mean like the players who are on the pitching roster. But like if you're curious about yourself, but maybe you haven't been exposed to the depth of astrology, so you're going to say, "Oh yeah, I'm a Virgo, so this is oh yeah, I do identify with those traits. Wow, that's interesting." So it's that sense of like making a connection without putting a lot of time in. But I think the vast majority of people don't know there are these other layers. There are so many layers.
And so for people who might be tuning in to this kind of level of understanding for the first time here, how would you start to open that up or tweak it to create a fuller picture for them?
Yeah, I mean, I would list a few of these these layers of personality, and I'd say, okay, here's a sun, center of the solar system, the biggest part of you energetically, and what you kind of have to do to burn fuel, like what fuel are you burning, what idea of self, what sense of self, how do you develop a coherent sense of having a personality? People are very complex, but how do we, cohere something that makes sense? The sun has a lot to do with that. And then I would say, but you also have emotional functions that are represented by the moon. And it's got its whole other configuration. It's got its whole other place in the map of your birth chart. And then I would say, and that's about needs and nurturing. It's about how you want to feel, what kinds of feelings you are attuned to feeling, like predisposed to respond to. And then you have a Mercury function, which is how your mind processes information, how you observe things, how you learn, how you write, teach, speak. And so I would break it down like that and kind of just add to that roster, so to speak, gradually. And you see I've done this so many times, and then you see the wheels turning in the head, and then suddenly it's like, wait a minute, that's a lot. When you realize, if we work with, however many archetypes, planets, 9 or whatever, 10 or whatever, depending on what you're into, that's a lot. And you say, yeah, there are different things you focus on. You understand the layers, and then you learn how to put them all together. But you can add to that. Then the Venus function, the Mars function, the belief function, so Venus, Mars, and then Jupiter. Yeah. and you just kind of expand it layer by layer.
Hmm. So, in the spirit of that, I want to take us over to the moon and start to explore another one of the players here. Is there anything else you want to share about the sun before we jump to the next big light in the sky?
I would just reiterate that, or I would speak an invitation, or say that it's really good to look at keyword lists from astrology teachers and writers, and of sun, for example, and then moon, to look at positive and what is deemed positive and negative about them, and really get a sense of the scope and the breadth, the terrain of that archetype through different teachers and writers to expose yourself. I mean, if I had a section on my website, maybe it would have 15 keywords, and maybe 3 or 5 of them would overlap with so and so who has a different website or a different book. And so to really get a sense of things, go through keyword lists. We said vitality, creativity, sense of self, ego. Gather keywords and understand that there are different ways to embody the energy. But if you don't embody the sun, you might feel empty, or you might feel empty or shallow or just unmotivated in general because that sun isn't being honored. That's so I encourage people who are learning astrology or getting into basics to be open to a bunch of different keyword lists and then drink it all in and develop a coherent image based in a lot of keywords, a lot of ideas.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
Then the
just
moon.
wondering if we want to.
Oh
I'm
yeah,
wondering
go
if we
ahead.
want to go through some examples of of maybe, since it's the first planet we're covering, just to like
Yeah.
really give people a way in to understanding. And since it's such a big part, do you want to just run through the 12 signs or something? Maybe we should save that for the signs episode. But like, do you feel like there's another way we can expand this out for people?
I'm not sure yet because of how all of the basic components fit together. You
Hmm.
can do it in so many different ways. I'm kind of inclined to wait.
I feel that. Yeah, let's. I guess we'll leave it
Yeah.
there. So we're building out a language here. This
Hmm.
is the sun piece, and then we'll have episodes in the future where you can put it together with the Taurus piece and
Yes.
start to form astrological sentences. But
Yep.
like you say, in the meantime, we can get Googling and start to learn more about these archetypes within ourselves and start to
Hmm.
understand these big parts of ourselves as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I guess let's move on to the moon then and start
Hmm.
talking about how can we think about this part of ourselves. We've mentioned it being changeable and having to do with emotions. What are some of the other main ways and to understand it, and can we expand on those meanings as well?
Yeah. Something I find really useful is from Steve Forrest, who says one has to feed one's moon often, if not every day, to be happy. Like something you have to do, and you can think of it as nurturing or self care, but the behaviors can be quite diverse depending on what house and what sign, what aspects that your moon has. But there's this thing you have to tend to on a regular, periodic basis. Not every 3 or 4 weeks, but maybe every day, maybe most days, if not every day. And so you could think of it as the personal side of you, the part that's relating emotionally to other people and to the world. And so you might be drawn to feed it in some way. And that's a kind of curiosity, but it's a related it's a you say that's not relatability. It's like developing a relationship with certain parts of life or certain ways of being. And if your moon has keywords to it with curiosity, but you don't express curiosity, you'll feel flat and stare out the window and wonder, why life is boring. If your moon has to do with building consistency or structure, and you don't do that, you'll feel empty and flat. And so, how can I think of it this way as a way of humanizing yourself on a regular basis. I don't think the goal of everything should be happiness, but I like what Steve says about you have to feed it, you have to do something to make it feel okay or to be happy. Yeah. So how you relate emotionally to other people, therefore family and personal relationships are involved and indicated. But also just like what makes you relax and open your heart. Like what is relaxing for you would be a good way to understand it too. What kinds of
Mm.
behaviors, what kinds of activities are restful for you?
Yeah, you see how these keywords intersect. It's like it's how we feel happy, or it's how we can take care of ourselves, and therefore it has to do with things that help us relax and feel secure and
Hmm.
comfortable, and how all those things intersect with one another, holistically
Hmm.
around this archetype that rules the all these different. And you can see how they just all connect into this thematic.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I
With
mean, when I'm
Mhm.
doing chart work with people, I take into account these aspects of personality and what each of them needs. And lately, I just a few months ago, a few weeks ago, there was a real strong example where I was talking to somebody with this image of rehumanizing. The details on what was in the chart don't really matter, but the sense of like I noticed that this is a Capricorn Sun person who was dealing with emotions and the need to honor emotions. And Capricorn, some people can be quite productive and dealing with structure and discipline and productivity, and they're building something. That's then they can forget sometimes. Any of us can, but that archetype emphasized, we can not honor our humanity. And so I was saying to this person all these things about the lunar archetype, the moon energy, and feeding your humanity. And I said, but I know some parts of you don't want to know this. And she laughed because so we acknowledge that different parts of us have these different agendas. And yeah, yeah,
There's a nuance here that I had written down about the moon, because so it has to do with feeling, but like, is it what we feel, or is it how we feel it, or is it our feeling nature in general? Is that a question that makes sense?
yeah. I think it's all of it.
Mm.
What I mean, what I would like to feel. What is it that helps me relax? Well, I would like to feel that. So I think that's and also I mean, I'll have all kinds of every human will have all kinds of different emotional responses to life, but we're on certain frequencies or certain things appeal to us, certain wavelengths or categories of human experience, and not on others all the time. So I think all those things in your question are. I think it's a good question. I'm trying to think of how to explain it without using a bunch of examples, which might be a little overwhelming for the beginners,
I'm
for
starting
for
to
somebody
get
who might be starting.
the
Yeah.
sense of like, so because we have all these placements, and like we can have feelings arise in response to something about our sun or our Mars or our
Yes.
Pluto, but maybe the moon points to how we are going to process it, and like what we want to feel, like it's our ideal feeling nature, or how we'll process things that arise from these other places in the chart, but it's the feeling function.
Yeah, the feeling function. And remember, since the moon is reflecting the light of the sun, doesn't have its own light, it's always responsive or reactive, as you indicated.
Mm. So prompts and triggers and reasons for feelings like beliefs and whatnot arise from all areas of the chart, and then the moon
Yes.
feels those things in its feeling way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
And then it's processing day to day, hour by hour, whatever. It's processing as we go.
And we can get in further down the line at some point.
Hmm.
We'll explore things like progressions and talk about the
Yeah.
evolving nature of, we all have windows into ways of feeling beyond just our own natal one, but as a starting point for understanding ourselves and our primary disposition, the moon is our picture into our feeling world.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Um, and so we already touched on this a bit, but just to expand a bit on, we touched on how it intersects with things like comfort, because it has to
Hmm.
do with how we want to feel and what makes us secure. Um,
Hmm.
a lot of people also point to the moon in terms of inner child
Yes.
and impressions and things like that. Do we want to explore that?
Yeah, I think it's important. Yeah. So people will look to the sun indicating your father and the moon as indicating your mother. If you're studying astrology in the beginning, you'll read that and hear that over and over and over again. Think about the sun as a kind of leadership energy and the moon as a nurturing energy. And it's not related to gender. So that's where I want to start with that. But yeah, there's a way that you look at a chart where caregivers can, in your life, can be indicated by your moon placement. It may not be, again, strictly gender based. Um, and I think that's just an assumption some astrology brains make that's just outmoded and outdated because people can have different roles, and fathers love kids as much as mothers do, But without the gender role imbalance, sometimes, right? Sometimes we have that, sometimes we don't. We're growing out of those strict um, cubby holes where people have been kind of shoved into that. But this nurturing style, we can look at your moon and kind of understand something about nurturing that you received. Then nurturing, by the same token, that you might develop and give to others. Your loving style is one way to think of it. But I don't want people to get too rigid about, you know, it works. If you look at my chart, if you look at Chris's chart or somebody's chart, and you look at the moon configuration, yeah, there's truth in there about some of our loved ones' caregivers. Same with everybody. I think it is, but just don't start there and be rigid about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And with it being our feeling nature, then it will be a portal into things like memory and processing stuff about
Mm-hmm.
family. And that can be
Yeah.
also where there's a point of interconnection between the two.
Yeah. Yeah. And we sometimes, whenever we open our heart to another person, especially when we're little kids, but it continues throughout our lives, we can connect with the energy field and emotions of other people and be influenced by or absorb their feelings too. Whenever we love, we might open our hearts and do that. And so that moon, representative of styles of loving, styles of caring, and also, like you said, memory, definitely.
Hmm.
And through the senses, like the smell. I haven't smelled that since, oh my gosh, my grandmother used to make blah blah blah, that kind of thing. And that childhood memory, that's really big on the moon. Later we'll talk about in another episode, we'll talk about Mercury, and there's a sensory thing about that too. But this is senses and emotional connotations or connections, where those smells or those feelings or yeah, yeah,
Mm. Differentiating it, like the emotions that are elicited versus the pure sense experience and the
yeah,
information of it or something.
exactly. The emotions attached to it that are elicited later. Yeah, totally, totally.
Hmm. Starting
Yeah,
to see how these archetypes, how these keywords come out of, it can be good to, because there will be overlap sometimes between,
yes,
and the differences can be subtle when things seem to share um, arenas, because Venus can have to do with what we like, but the moon is what makes us feel good. And so
hmm,
what's the distinction there? We look to the keywords, and the moon is an archetype about feeling,
hmm,
and emotion,
hmm,
right? You started to say something there about how a lot of people will point to, or a lot of systems really. It's been built in since ancient astrology that like
yeah,
you get these associations with the sun and the moon and the mother and the father, but you hear all kinds of other things too. People who are coming into this um, will probably have heard an array of different things. Maybe the sun is the soul, or the sun is the ego, and the moon is the soul, or the moon is the soul and the sun is the ego. And there can be all these different archetypal pairings that come in with the two together. Do
yeah.
you have a take on that, or is there a system that you use when you're looking at them both in a pairing or a duality like that?
I mean, the way I think of them when I think of them together is these. as we began. These two central, quite these two most significant aspects of personality development and expression. As far as those things, I don't buy into those things because I've been shaped by the channeling I've done, which includes a coherent model of soul. So as humans typically use the word soul, it doesn't work for me because I've been working with a disembodied being who explains what soul is in a very cogent, coherent way. And so I don't. So some of those things I don't get in. Most of them I don't get into because I have a different definition of soul.
Hmm.
Um, but also the same thing of gender identity, or how do you say that? Not gender identity. Gender roles. Same thing. My dad was pretty smooth and placid. My mom was a volcano of ambition. So it's like you might expect that to be reversed, but in my experience, it was very different. And so I don't typically I identify a lot with traditional assignations of meaning in that way,
Hmm.
or division of labor is what I wanted to say earlier, and I said gender roles, but division of labor. So I don't go for those things just because my experience and my training is different.
Yeah, yeah, and just a lot of, I mean, with astrology, and it's such a complex language with so many different traditions
Yeah,
and systems,
yeah,
and that like we all have different ways of using the language, and that is just a matter of resonance and not
yeah.
um, invalidation or disagreement, even to say
Right,
that like and I know same with me. When I look at a chart, I look at the sun and the moon, and I have a particular way of pulling, reading meaning out of those archetypes, and then there'll
right.
be other astrologers trained in different ways that can derive equally valid kind of
Yeah.
responses through systems that just haven't made sense or clicked as my way to speak the language.
Yeah, and that's why I say read a bunch of people's books, keyword lists, websites, courses, so you find out what feels true to you and what groove you makes sense,
Hmm.
to be in. That's why it's so valuable that there are so many people doing it. It's sometimes frustrating if a beginner says, "But this person says that, and this person says that, and this 17th person says the 19th thing." How do I know? And it's really like, what house system should I use? Get that question all the time. And there's no right or wrong answer. You find out what works for you through experience and trial and error and experimentation.
It doesn't have to be conflict. It can be different parts of the same elephant
Yeah,
too, or like
right.
what you're tuning into here is one gleaning facet on a multifaceted gem of understanding, and you
Yeah,
can take this and get something out of it, or then mix it and match it with other angles on it too, and
right.
ultimately it comes down to us finding our personal resonance with the system.
That's right. That's right. And
Cool.
it's good to interview different approaches. It's really healthy. Yeah.
I feel like that it's good that that kind of all came through at the onset here to give our like the just the prompt of framing up that you're tuning into an approach of astrology and a particular flavor of understanding with us here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I guess to round out, just finishing exploring with the sun and the moon, we've looked at how they work in natal configurations, or the birth chart, your personal birth chart, which, by the way, the word for that is natal. Um, and how would we differentiate that from how they move in transit, as in when the actual sun and the actual moon in real time are moving around the chart, activating our charts? Um, their meanings still same archetype, but they can show up in a distinguished way compared to how we're talking about them in the birth chart, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So the birth chart or the natal chart is how a person is imprinted with energies at birth. So there is that configuration, that constellation, that roadmap, so to speak, that lasts one's whole life. And then these transiting planets, as you're saying, like where the sun actually is in the sky, where the moon actually is. Um, Always remember the importance of time, because if you're a Capricorn sun and a Cancer moon, that's where they are your whole life. But the sun moves roughly a degree per day through the sky. And the moon moves, what is it, uh, 13 new moons a year or something like that. So it's a, under a month of its own cycle, right? I'm going to mix up terms, so I'm trying to avoid being too
About
specific.
28 days for it to go
28 days.
around, and it's like
Yeah.
12 degrees a day ish.
Okay, thank you. And so the sun moving 1 degree a day, the moon moving 12 degrees a day ish, you can see that there are different emphases. And in astrology, when you think about transits or moving planets in the sky, the slower, the more impactful. So moon things 12 degrees a day, that's not going to build up meaningfulness, but it can make you be aware of certain things emotionally, energetically. It's obviously very changeable if it's making that all that movement. And then the sun 1 degree per day, it's not going to build up a lot of meaningfulness and depth, because if you figure like a degree before or 2 degrees before, two after, you're just a degree a day. It's not like a 3 month transit. It's like a 3 or 4 day thing. 2.5, 3, 4 days. The moon could be a couple hours, several hours, where something is activated. So you have your imprint of sun energy in your own personality, as indicated by your birth chart, natal chart. You also have a moon imprint, but then these things activate us to different degrees over time. When I say fast and slow, the moon is the fastest. The inner planets are fast. The inner planets, just for reference here, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Mars, Venus. I did that out of order. Venus, Mars. Outer planets, Saturn, Jupiter are kind of in the middle, sometimes said social planets or something like that. And they're kind of middle ground. They're not super fast, they're not super slow, but Uranus on out are much more slow in transit, so they build much more steam. Like you might have a Pluto transit that, depending on the math you like to use on either side, it could be 2.5 or 3 years that it has great influence. Whereas the moon, it could be a half a day or a quarter of a day. Yeah.
So as the moon sweeps through, and it might be 13 degrees a day, somewhere
You're right up
around
there. Yeah, it's 12.5, 12, 13. Yeah, it's something like that.
And that's where we get moods, right? Mood.
Yes.
And it will have a passing moon as our feeling nature moves over some part of the chart. And actually, as I was getting started learning about astrology, and I'm very Cancerian, I'm very moon ruled, so there's a lot of moon techniques that have worked for me. But one of the ways that one of the most effective things I did to learn astrology was to watch the moon go around and feel how it felt when it changed signs or when it activated planets. And because it's like there's like an empathic blending at that time of like, oh, my Jupiter feels like this and this part of my chart feels like this, and you kind of get to know it as an emotional tour. If you're disposed to that kind of thing, mileage may vary depending on how much Cancer you got, but
some people are more sensitive to it than others, but if you find yourself noticing these cyclic things, that would be a great tool to like tune in and be aware of. Not that you should run your life by every little detail, but to understand the energies and how people respond and how communities and groups experience things sometimes by such energies. Yeah, so it's a great exercise.
Getting to know the language,
more sensitive than others.
Not just intellectually, but like the feeling language of astrology can be really helpful. For me, was very helpful.
Yeah, like what is it like when we're all under a moment of Virgo? Or what is it like when the world is under a Leo moon or something like that? And you can observe how people behave and feel and how they respond to each other, and
And then with the sun, it's lighting things up, right, for a couple days at a time, and likewise, it's a longer sweep. You're not gonna get a tour of your whole chart in 28 days, but in the course of a year, you'll have everything in your chart illuminated and spotlighted once for a couple days, one day in particular, and that can also be a way to, because it'll bring emphasis to as it passes there.
Yeah. And I would just invite people who are beginners or getting into this, in a deeper way for the first time to not assume value judgments of everything. Because what I was going to say first was, and so I just prefaced it with that, but what I want to say is you might notice certain, you might notice like 3 or 4 times a year, you kind of have this attitude that's not normal. And you might look at where is the sun 3 or 4 times a year. That could be a Mercury thing. It goes around the sun 3 times a year. That could be different kind of aspects with the sun to something in your chart, where you're feeling a response elicited, and you can correlate. Oh, I'm being activated by that in this mathematical way. As you learn more about aspects and different things, which we'll get into over the course of this podcast. And so you can actually see that. And when I met my partner 11 years ago, she said to me, look, when the sun goes into my 12th house, which is the one before the ascendant, right? The ascendant's the first part of the cycle in the sense of I'm here, I exist. The 12th house is I'm letting go of things. I might be a little spacey. She said, look, this is when it hits the 12th house every year, and this is when it crosses my ascendant. For those 3.5 weeks, I'm a little less available, and I'm not thinking about things, and I just want to like hide under a blanket. And I said, well, that's lame and weird. Anyway, I started researching it and looking at my own version of that, and I have the same thing, just different time of year because I have a different rising. So that sense of like the sun highlights different aspects of your life or different portions of life in different years. And I did this. I think, Chris, you might have taken this class when I was doing the subscription thing about
your chart as a clock.
Thank you. Yes. So to understand, when does Chris want to hide out under a blanket, or when can he not remember certain details or want to pay attention to things? Aha, that's his 12th house time. And to kind of like get to know these essentially cross-quarter markers of, and then kind of to live more in harmony with how you're wired. Because we can think about it seasonally, but then everyone's got their own kind of seasons as well based on where things are in their own chart.
That's a great way to put it, that like we all have our own personal like seasonality.
Yeah. It's very useful because, like you say, the sun doesn't, it doesn't spend a lot of time anywhere, but it shows you something. I've called it the great big flashlight in the sky for some years, because it goes into a sign and suddenly you realize, oh, look at that. I should pay attention to that more. I just had it, what it was, a day and a half ago, and the things I thought about, I said, the sun, I think, must have just entered Virgo. Because I was very my attention was put on things with a Virgoan influence, and I was like, oh, sure, I can fix that. Or, oh, I notice why that's happening. Oh, I can change that. And it was very Virgoan, and I wasn't paying attention to transits or where the sun was. I don't do forecasts right now, and so I'm not thinking about where things are all the time. But I felt a certain way, and I responded to my environment in a certain way, and I was like, feels like Virgo. I looked, sun was at 1 Virgo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As we get into talking about houses and their meanings and signs, then you can take this principle and get on, use some kind, if you have an astrology program, or if you go to astro.com, or I like luna.com, there's services that will show you the current transiting planets, and you can see, okay, well, the sun's moving through my 2nd house right now, or my 3rd house, and then watch, and you can start to put these sentences together and get to know these different seasons as you just, start where you are and watch it unfold. It'll be very educational.
Yeah, definitely.
If you want to.
Yeah. And I think, Chris, just planting a note for you and me, planting a seed, I think it would be great to do that house as a clock at some point after there's enough background information that we provide, to build on it with that, because I just planting that seed for the future down the road.
Totally. We got a whole plot of seeds here.
I know.
I'm careful of of not going too deep into the complexity box.
Yeah.
But I think it's also interesting to note that because we all have different personal chart blueprints, everyone's experience of different phases and transits is different too. One person you talk to will be like, I love Leo season every year. So great to just be in the fire. And, and maybe when the
Mm-hmm.
sun moves through Leo, they're getting, easy aspects left and right, and it's in their fifth house or something. Someone else might be,
Mm.
that might be the time of year when they have 20 squares and 7 quincunxes going on, and it feels like
Right.
they have to go through their most challenging phase of the year. So there is no good and bad energy. There is no right and wrong archetype. We
Mm-hmm.
all have different relationships to all of these different building blocks.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and so we'll work up to that piece by piece. And I guess that's it for our episode on the luminaries. Thank you for joining us at the beginning of our adventure here. We're very excited. And we'll be back to do the personal planets, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, in the next episode.